The first question is, of course, about this decision of Russian authority of mobilization. Why you think they decided to do this? Because it's very risky for them, for the government of Russia. Which possible consequences for Russia? And could the United States in some way react on this to provide Ukraine more significant help than it now to defeat it?
Yes. I think this decision to mobilize another 300,000 or more Russian soldiers is a sign of desperation. I think it's a sign that President Putin knows that he is losing on the battlefield against a determined Ukrainian military. He recognizes that his soldiers are tired and depleted. He is running very short of manpower, of soldiers, and he's looking for replacement soldiers wherever he can find them. So far, he's not been able to succeed. He has failed at getting enough prisoners from jails, or from the North Koreans, or from the Belarusians, or from the private sector, or from the Syrians and Libyans. He has not been able to come up with soldiers that he needs. So he needs to do something to change the subject, to change the momentum. And even though, as you say, this is risky for him, we already see the risks, the political risks for him, that the Russian people are now opposing this call up, this mobilization, and his supporters on the right are criticizing him for not being stronger. So Mr. Putin has found himself in a very difficult position and is trying to find a way out. It shows to me that he is desperate.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about the result of this mobilization for situation on the battlefield? Could it be effective, and could Ukraine expect some new offensive of Russian forces, for instance, some attacks in Kyiv region on something like that?
I don't think that this mobilization will show any results in the near term, over the next weeks or even months. It'll take weeks and probably months to recruit these soldiers. He's having a hard time recruiting anyway. There's a lot of resistance to this order. So he's not having very much luck on the recruiting side. He then has to transport them, train them, and equip them. That takes time as well. And then he has to try to get them into the battle, into Ukraine. And that will take even more time. So I don't look to see any real changes in the Russian forces, the level of forces or the quality of forces over the next several months. And during that time, the Ukrainian forces appear to be ready and able, and in the process of continuing the counterattack, continuing the counteroffensive, to push hard on the Russians that are now weak. The Russians, as President Putin has indicated, are now weak on the battlefield, and the Ukrainian military is taking advantage of that weakness.
Does the Ukraine army need some extra help, some new types of weapons to be so effective as it now after this Russian mobilization?
Yes. The United States and other NATO nations need to provide more weapons, more of the sophisticated, heavier, longer range weapons, both on the artillery rocket systems, as well as air defense, as well as I would say that the Ukrainians have requested more drones, aircraft ought to be a consideration, and armored vehicles. So yes, the short answer is the Ukrainian military needs to continue to get the kind of equipment that the United States and the NATO allies have been providing, and even more of it and more sophisticated versions of these weapons.
Mm-hmm. A lot of observer from the sphere of Russian nationalists, they think and suppose that this mobilization is answer not for West, but for East after this summit in Samarkand, when Putin found that he is alone in the world. What do you think could be this summit unsuccessful for Russia, this trigger which provoke Putin to provide this mobilization?
I think you're right. That summit demonstrated that even the large nations that President Putin was counting on to support him, in particular China and India, as well as nations like Kazakhstan, are not supporting him, have questions about this invasion, have concerns about this invasion. They have asked him why he is invading Ukraine. They've not been convinced that this is a good idea. So President Putin knows that he doesn't have that kind of support. And again, it puts him in a difficult position, both abroad with these allies, as well as at home with the opposition to this mobilization, both from the bottom as well as from his nationalist right, and from the successful Ukrainian military attacks, counteroffensives on the battlefield. So he is looking at three bad situations.
Mm-hmm. Iranian drones, they are in Ukraine now. We see reports, several videos, how they were used in Ukraine. What do you think, how United States, other nations, they could prevent Iran from supplying this weapon to Russia?
It's interesting that the Iranians have now denied that they are providing these weapons, although you're right, they've been found on the battlefield. So we know that the Iranians are doing this. And the United States should provide anti-aircraft, air defense capabilities to the Ukrainians to enable them to defend against these drones. It is possible to defend against these drones, and they should do that. We've also provided, and we should provide more of our drones to the Ukrainian military so that they can use these as well. The Ukrainian military are using the drones extremely effectively, and the volume and the capability of these drones should go up.
Mm-hmm. Last year ago, President Zelensky had visit to Washington, and I know that you have some meeting with him. And from my point of view, you have a very positive attitude towards Zelensky, and you had this attitude even before invasion. What do you think about his behavior after invasion? Do you expect that former comedian could be effective military leader?
You're right. I met President Zelensky when he was first inaugurated in 2019. I was there for his first 7 months in office when he appointed his first cabinet, prime minister, undertook a very successful parliamentary election. And I met with him on many occasions. I was always impressed then about his leadership capability, about his communications capability. So I was not surprised that he, in the face of this invasion, stepped up to a major role in Ukrainian history, a major role in the history of the world in opposition to this Russian invasion. He has demonstrated that he has the strong support of the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainian people support him, according to all the polls. He is able to make decisions in their favor and on their behalf, on the Ukrainian people's behalf, that have galvanized, have strengthened, have inspired not just the Ukrainian people, but the international community. The whole West is supporting Ukraine, and President Zelensky has led that support. You asked about the military leadership. I think one of the strengths of President Zelensky is that he is allowing his military, his general officers, to make the military decisions. As I understand it, he is allowing them to make the decision. President Zelensky is not trying to tell them how to run the war. He, of course, has overall responsibility, and he, of course, has overall oversight over the operation of the war. But he knows that he's not a general. He knows that he's not been in the military. He knows that his general officers, his general staff, his military is very competent and is doing a very good job at defending the nation and indeed of pushing back the Russians out of his country. So I think that's a strength. He is delegating correctly to his military the military decisions. I think that's a mark of a very good civilian leader during wartime.
And you have, I don't know, I know that you have a close connection with a lot of Ukrainian military. You have even a photo with Ukrainian paratroopers in your cabinet. What do you feel when 24th of February, when you realize that war started, and maybe you got some messages from Ukraine, how it was for you?
It was a terrible shock on the 24th of February, like it was to everyone around the world, in Ukraine, in Europe, in the United States. Terrible shock that President Putin would invade his neighbor. I did hear from my friends in the military, and you're right, I'm very proud of my training with the Ukrainian military back when I was in Ukraine. They demonstrated to me, the Ukrainian soldiers that I trained with back in 2008, demonstrated to me the spirit, the competence, the bravery of the Ukrainian military. And so I was shocked that President Putin invaded. I was sure that the Ukrainian military would fight and fight hard, and in the end, fight successfully to repel the Russians when they tried to invade Ukraine.
Years ago, it was this massive withdrawal of United States Army from Afghanistan. And in some way, it inspired, I think, Putin to invade Ukraine. He expected that situation would be the same as that president fled to some other country, that civil services would be collapsed. What is the main difference between these two cases, Afghanistan and Ukraine?
The main difference is Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian leadership. Ukrainian people are now more united than ever. They started this unification years ago, and gradually this happened. But in 2014, when the Russians first invaded, Ukrainians began to get even closer together. And in 2022, on the 24th of February, Ukrainians consolidated their unity behind President Zelensky in response to the Russian invasion. And that's different from what happened in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is much more decentralized, more tribal. The leadership, as I say, in Ukraine, President Zelensky stayed in the capital, stayed in Kyiv. In Afghanistan, the government disappeared. The government fled. The government left Kabul. And in Kyiv, the government stayed. The government showed bravery. The government showed determination. And the government led and is leading a successful defense against the Russians. So there's a big difference between what happened in Afghanistan and what happened in Ukraine. And the difference is the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian leadership. This probably surprised President Putin. President Putin probably thought that the Ukrainian leadership would not stay in Kyiv. He may have thought that, like in Afghanistan, the Ukrainian leadership would lead. President Putin may have thought that, like in Afghanistan, the Americans would not stay, would not be solid behind their ally, Ukraine. And in that case, President Putin was wrong. He made a mistake. He misunderstood the Ukrainians, misunderstood President Zelensky, and he misunderstood the Americans. The Americans and President Zelensky and the Ukrainians surprised President Putin by their determination and their bravery.
Mm-hmm. You almost the peers with President Putin. You are both from one generation. I don't know. I understand that this is maybe strange questions, but from your point of view, why he thinks that 70s were better than 80s, and 80s were better than 90s? Why he wants to rebuild this situation of, I don't know, Soviet era, of imperial era? Why he like to live in past?
It's a very good question, Vitaliy. It's a very good question. No one understands President Putin's head, I am sure. I know I don't understand why he would think that the Soviet times were so good and that now is the time to reassemble the Soviet Union. I don't understand that. President Putin could have had the opportunity to have a nation, a Russia, that was prosperous, that was surrounded by friendly nations. But no, President Putin decided he didn't want a prosperous nation. He didn't want to have friendly neighbors. He wanted to invade his neighbors. He invaded Georgia, as we know, in 2008. He invaded Ukraine in 2014, invaded again in 2020. He has made the decisions that have brought the Russians down. He has made terrible decisions for his country, for Russia. He may think that by trying to reassemble the Soviet Union back in the 70s and 80s, that he would be a great leader, a great Russian leader. Well, it turns out he's going to have destroyed Russia. He will go down in history as a terrible Russian leader. So I don't understand what's in his head. All I know is he's made a major mistake, a major blunder, a terrible decision by invading Ukraine.